Tonight at 10, trials of a second vaccine for coronavirus bring very promising results. It could be available by next spring. The US biotech firm Moderna revealed the outcome of phase 3 trials, showing the vaccine is almost 95% effective.
I broke into an ear-to-ear grin when I heard the numbers. It really exceeded our best hopes, and it is an incredibly exciting moment for us.
It's been tested on a wide range of people, but it comes with a note of caution, as did the vaccine unveiled last week.
As we constantly stress, neither of these vaccines is approved. We haven't seen the full safety data. We can't be sure.
We'll have more details on this latest vaccine, as England might be facing a stronger tier system when the lockdown is over. Also tonight, visits to loved ones in care homes in England will be possible by Christmas, according to ministers. Boris Johnson has said that devolution north of the English border has been a disaster. The First Minister of Scotland says the Conservatives are a threat to the Scottish Parliament. A year-long BBC investigation in Kenya uncovers horrifying evidence of babies being stolen and sold for a few £100s. And in China, we have the story of the British diplomat who saved a young woman from drowning and became a local hero.
And coming up in the sports on BBC News, from the Hollywood Hills to North Wales, film stars Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney's takeover of National League club Wrexham is a wrap.
Good evening. The United Kingdom has secured a deal for an initial delivery of 5 million doses of a brand new vaccine developed by the US biotech firm Moderna. The deal means that the vaccine could be delivered from the spring of next year if it's approved by the regulator. The Health Secretary for England, Matt Hancock, warned that the safety data was limited and that the firm's production facilities were not yet fully developed. Moderna says that the trials so far show the vaccine is almost 95% effective. It's been tested on a range of people, including the over 65s, people with underlying medical conditions and those from different ethnic backgrounds. And crucially, it can be stored at normal refrigerated temperatures, making it much easier to distribute possibly than the Pfizer vaccine announced last week. Well, there are currently around 50 vaccines being tested worldwide, and the latest success has raised hopes that others could be on the way. Our medical editor, Fergus Walsh, has the story.
Another dose of hope and further evidence that vaccines will provide a way out of this pandemic.
Thank you.
Stunning early results from this trial from US firm Moderna have eclipsed the strong ones just a week ago from Pfizer-BioNTech.
I broke into an ear-to-ear grin when I heard the numbers. It really exceeded our best hopes. And it is an incredibly exciting moment for us as a company and as a world as we start to develop tools to fight the virus.
30,000 volunteers in the US took part in the trials. Half had 2 doses of the vaccine a month apart, the rest dummy injections. Early analysis shows there were 90 COVID cases in those given the dummy treatment and only 5 in the vaccinated group. Moderna says this shows the vaccine is over 94% effective at preventing COVID. What's more, there were 11 cases of severe disease, but none among those who got the vaccine.
I'd like to update you on the latest coronavirus data.
The government urged people to follow the COVID rules because even an effective vaccine won't change the way we live for months. But optimism is growing. Are you a bit more confident today, even more confident than a week ago, that COVID vaccines will work?
It's brilliant news, absolutely brilliant. It's the second penalty now. That's also gone into the back of the net. So we're starting to feel in a better position.
Moderna, like Pfizer, have used a completely new method for creating vaccines which doesn't need the virus itself. It uses the genes for the coronavirus spike protein. This synthetic code, known as RNA, is created in the laboratory and forms the vaccine. This teaches the body to recognise and build an immune response to coronavirus. The Moderna vaccine doesn't need to be stored at ultra-low temperatures like Pfizer's and will keep for up to 30 days in a normal fridge, making distribution easier. Before we can all throw away our face masks and ditch social distancing, we're going to need to protect the world from COVID. That will require billions of doses of coronavirus vaccine, and it's why clinical trials must continue. Like this one, which began today in Southampton and other sites across the UK. The jab from the Belgian firm Janssen is one of 6 COVID vaccines pre-ordered by the government.
Over time, we will learn which of those works better in different ages and different people with different conditions, and also how to use the vaccines in combinations to give people the best and longest lasting immunity.
Caution is needed. We still need full safety and effectiveness data for the Moderna and Pfizer jabs. But there's a real sense now that some of the most vulnerable to COVID could be immunised before Christmas.
And Fergus is with me here in the studio. You allowed yourself a hint of a smile a week ago, Fergus. So how would you guide viewers along the hopes which attach themselves to this second vaccine?
Well, the smile is even broader tonight, Hugh. It's hugely encouraging. It shows last week's positive news was not a flash in the pan. Now, we've got to be cautious. The numbers could change. Wait for the safety data. But 95% effective. That is beyond the dreams of any scientist involved in this research. And on the Moderna trial, there were 7,000 people over 65. There were thousands of volunteers with serious risk factors, and there was a wide range of ethnicities, so all very promising. Now, if the vaccines get approved, we can start at some point, maybe around summertime next year, to start planning for a post-pandemic future. Now, Moderna, we've got enough doses coming by late spring to immunise about 2.5 million people in the UK. Pfizer, enough doses for 20 million people. Most of those will start coming early next year. And then the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, we will have enough doses next year to immunise 50 million people in the UK. But we have to consider the world. This is a global pandemic. But given the devastation to lives and livelihoods from this pandemic, it is heartening to be able to report more good news.
Fergus, indeed. Thank you very much again, Fergus Walsh, our medical editor. Well, visits to loved ones in care homes in England will be possible by Christmas, according to ministers. Families and campaigners have been increasingly critical of the negative impact that the ban on visits has had on care home residents, especially those with dementia. A pilot scheme involving 20 homes in Hampshire, Devon and Cornwall, which will provide regular testing, got underway today. Our social affairs correspondent Alison Holt has more details.
This was mid-March before lockdown, the last time 67-year-old Bob Such and his wife Chris were able to hug. He has Alzheimer's and had just moved into a care home.
See you so much. Oh. Yeah.
Since then, most of their contact's been like this, deeply distressing for them both. The testing pilot offers hope for the future, but it still feels a long way off.
It's been absolutely cruel to see him scratching at the window, him calling, come in, come in. He doesn't understand. He's in the latter stages of dementia, and his well-being and quality of life have been severely impacted, as has mine.
Their son's a doctor working on a busy hospital COVID ward. He deals with the risks each day and says it should be possible for families to have closer contact in care homes.
It's a catastrophe for everyone in a similar scenario, including me, because we don't get this time back. You know, my father and lots of other people will deteriorate during this period, and we appreciate the difficulties everybody's facing. It's not easy for us all to manage, but it must be managed, and we must find solutions.
Testing is seen as the key to safe visits. I was tested at a home by care staff last week who had a machine to provide a quick result. The pilot scheme will use slightly different tests, but will allow regular checks for named relatives or friends. It's promised this will then roll out nationally.
Our goal is to ensure that we have the testing available in every care home by Christmas to make sure that people can then take a test and therefore see their loved ones safely.
To comply with CQC regulations in order.
But with coronavirus cases rising in hospitals, homes like this one in Scarborough are making preparations for accepting COVID-positive patients to ease pressures. After so many care home deaths from the virus nationally, infection control checks are now tougher.
We have a COVID-positive isolated floor, dedicated staff, dedicated facilities, so they don't come into contact with anyone else. But as I say, these people have to be looked after somewhere, and if we don't look after them, they have to go miles away from where they perhaps live for their recuperation.
It underlines the complications of the situation, balancing the many pressures with the needs of residents and relatives.
It's so cruel, Joe.
I know, Mum. It is cruel.
But for families like the Suches, visitor testing by Christmas is a target that must not be missed. Alison Holt, BBC News.
Well, let's have a look at the latest coronavirus figures. Another 21,363 new infections were recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means an average of 25,331 new cases every day in the past week. There were an average of 1,696 hospital admissions every day in the week to last Wednesday. Another 213 deaths were reported today. That total is normally a bit lower after the weekend. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means an average of 416 deaths per day in the past week. And that takes the total official number of UK deaths so far to 52,147. Now, England's regional tier system of COVID restrictions might need to be strengthened to get people through the winter. That's according to Dr. Susan Hopkins from Public Health England. A three-tier system had been used in England to tackle the spread of the virus before the lockdown began. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, is here. Hugh, talk us through this tier system as it might be reformed.
Well, Hugh, Dr. Hopkins of PHE was speaking at the Downing Street briefing alongside the Health Secretary Matt Hancock, and the question came up, what's going to happen in England after the current lockdown ends on December the 2nd? Now, she said the tier system would, in her view, have to continue, but have to be actually strengthened, the three tiers, to, quote, get us through the winter. And she indicated she thought that Tier 1, the lowest level in England, hadn't worked. In Tier 2, it had only worked in some areas, whereas what had worked was Tier 3 plus, the toughest restrictions seen in some parts of England, including the northwest. And actually cases had been coming down just before the England-wide lockdown in early November. So the implication is you could have the tiers, but with slightly tougher restrictions. So it raises the big question, what's going to happen over the Christmas season? Now, there have been no firm indications from government yet. I understand the Cabinet Office is looking very carefully at how this might work after the end of November, what might have to actually be put in place. They're going to look very carefully at the case data. Has the England-wide lockdown actually had a big impact? They'll know by the end of this week or early next week if cases are falling. Then they'll have to work out what areas would go into what tiers. But the issue of Christmas is a very sensitive one and what will happen there. Meanwhile, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has indicated that tomorrow some council areas might be moved to Scotland's highest level, level 4, with tougher restrictions. In her own words, to see if it's possible then to have some sort of easing over Christmas.
OK, Hugh, many thanks again. Hugh Pym there, our health editor. Now, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and 6 other Conservative MPs, along with 2 political aides, have all been told to self-isolate after a meeting in Downing Street last Thursday. One of the MPs has since tested positive for coronavirus. Downing Street said that social distancing rules had been observed. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, reports now there are some flashing images coming up.
The moment you might dread from your phone or inbox. A message from the coronavirus trackers to stay at home and stay away. The Prime Minister stuck in number 10 too.
They pinged me and I've got to self-isolate because somebody I was in contact with a few days ago has developed COVID. It doesn't matter that I'm fit as a butcher's dog, feel great. So many people do in my circumstances. And actually, it doesn't matter that I've had the disease and I'm bursting with antibodies. We've got to interrupt the spread of the disease.
On Thursday, Boris Johnson met with half a dozen MPs, at least meant to be keeping their distance. But on Saturday, Lee Anderson from Ashfield tested positive. The 5 others who were there are all self-isolating now too. Meetings are allowed in person for work. But even in Downing Street, strict rules are meant to be followed to make sure it's safe. But now the Prime Minister's holed up between his desk and the Downing Street flat. Not because he has the disease, but because he spent some time in close quarters to one who has. But after days of dizzying allegations about what's been going on in government, this was meant to be a moment for ministers to get back on track.
Government, like all other businesses and organisations over the past few months, has been learning to do things differently. We're doing a lot of meetings online. Prime Minister's already, this morning, you've seen a video that he's put out. We're getting on with delivering people's priorities. This has been
like cracking on with rolling out a vaccine which Labour wants and sticking to the rules.
This is frustrating for the Prime Minister, I understand that. It's important that he self-isolates. It's important for all of us to say that we've got to comply with the advice and the guidance.
Rules may have never bothered some in government that much. Burning Downing Street feuds flamed into public in the last few days. Dominic Cummings, who couldn't ever resist playing the pantomime villain, walking off into the dark. A lot of metaphorical blood has been spilt on Downing Street's posh carpets of late. So the Prime Minister wanted to use this week to clean up, with announcements on the environment, meetings with MPs, no small matter of Brexit talks that go on too. But an email from the tracers has seen him locked indoors. Perhaps it's coronavirus that's still in charge. Governments can plan for resets, relaunches, restarts, but no minister can plan for real life. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Earlier this evening, the Prime Minister reportedly told a group of MPs that devolution had been a disaster north of the border and that the policy had been Tony Blair's government's biggest mistake. Downing Street has not denied the reports. The comments were made earlier this evening when he spoke to a group of MPs from the north of England. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, responded by saying that the remarks proved that the Conservatives were a threat to the powers of the Scottish Parliament. Now, our political correspondent, Jessica Parker, is at Westminster. Jessica, some more details on what was said and indeed what's Downing Street saying to try to explain the context of this?
Good evening. I think this will be seen as something of a political clangor by Boris Johnson. As you say, the comments emerged after he held a virtual call with dozens of Conservative MPs who represent seats in the north of England earlier this evening. The subject of devolution came up, and that is when the Prime Minister is reported to have said devolution has been a disaster north of the border and it was Tony Blair's biggest mistake. Now, as you say, Downing Street has not denied the reports. Number 10 sources tonight insisting the Prime Minister's always supported devolution, that it's great, but not, as they put it, when used by separatists and nationalists to break up the UK. The SNP has immediately reacted to the comments, saying it shows that the government here in Westminster is a threat to the powers of the Scottish Parliament. And I think this could be a problem, a potential embarrassment for Scottish Conservatives. Remember, we are 6 months out from a crucial Holyrood election where Scottish independence, Scotland's place in the Union, is set to be a central issue.
Jessica, many thanks again for the update. Jessica Parker there at Westminster. Now, the US President-elect Joe Biden has warned tonight that President Trump's refusal to work on a transition of power could lead to more American deaths from coronavirus. Mr. Biden said that urgent work was needed to coordinate vaccination programs. Our North America editor, John Sopel, is in Washington. John, tell us more about Mr. Biden's warning.
Yeah, I think that Joe Biden had been trying to play everything down, keep everything calm. But the stubborn refusal of the president to allow succession talks to take place, the transition of power, I think is reaching kind of new heights of frustration for Joe Biden. And so he's saying that people will die. He's not getting briefed on the pandemic, on what the administration is doing, the rollout of the vaccine, but also on national security briefings as well. And I think that that is causing concern among leading Republicans too, who feel that Joe Biden should get those briefings. Why aren't they happening? Because Donald Trump still believes he's won the election, and he tweeted as much in block capitals at 1:45 this morning. But his legal case is going badly. And there's his national security advisor, a key figure in the Trump administration, who has said this: look, if the Biden-Harris ticket is determined to be the winner, and obviously things look like that at the moment, we'll have a very professional handover. Two things to note about that. One, it's the first senior Trump administration official to say anything like that. And two, they are thinking about the transition. The problem is that Donald Trump isn't.
John, many thanks. Once again, John Sopel there for us, our North America editor. Now, a year-long investigation in Kenya by BBC Africa Eye has uncovered horrifying evidence of babies being stolen and sold for a few £100s. They're often sold to those desperate for children but unable to conceive themselves. Those responsible are preying on the country's most vulnerable people and taking babies from the streets and even from hospitals. Our correspondent Njeri Mwangi has been talking to some of those affected in Nairobi.
Thousands of children live on the streets of Nairobi. They have become prime targets for child traffickers. We've been approached by an informant who claims to know an active child trafficker called Anita, targeting homeless mothers. At great risk, our informant agrees to go undercover and arranges to meet her. To her horror, she finds that Anita has just stolen a baby. Anita claims she has a buyer lined up who is prepared to pay around £350. In a desperate attempt to stop her from selling the child, our informant tells her she knows a buyer who is willing to pay over £550. A child's life is in immediate danger. So we reported the case to the police, who agreed to try to arrest Anita. But she never returns with the baby. We heard she sold the child to a higher bidder. Anita has disappeared into the shadows and never responded to our allegations. The police are still looking for her. But just how widespread are incidences like this? One charity tells me they have recorded almost 600 cases over the past 3 years and says most of the demand comes from desperate women.
To keep a marriage, you have to have a child. And on top of that, you also have to have a boy. So you go back to the village and they call you, you're barren. They call you a dry piece of wood.
Miriana says one sale can fetch more than the average Kenyan's yearly income, as we were soon to discover. A whistleblower informs us that Fred Leparan, a hospital-based social worker, is selling children born at the Mama Lucy Kibaki Hospital. He agrees to go undercover and tells Mr. Leparan that a family friend called Rose is desperate to buy a child after failing to conceive. Mr. Leparan already has a child, abandoned by his mother, in mind. When he meets Rose, he has no idea that she is in fact an undercover reporter.
Around 300.
That's the equivalent of around £2,000. He agrees to sell Rose the boy instead of transferring him to a local children's home. Mr. Leparan arranges for an unsuspecting hospital nurse to give the baby to Rose. We immediately deliver the child safely to a government-approved home. Here, the boy will be cared for until a legitimate adoption can be arranged.
Hi.
Mr. Leparan calls Rose to a meeting. Now, he wants his money. We confronted Mr. Leparan with our evidence outside the gates of the hospital.
We have a reason to believe that you're involved in child trafficking. What do you have to say about that?
Me. Huh?
Me? Yes, you.
No. We also put our allegations to him and the hospital's management in writing, but neither responded.
The scenes that I have witnessed in the making of this investigation have shocked me to my core. As a woman, as a mother, as a Kenyan, traffickers are operating in plain sight. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of our children have been sold like cattle, stripped of their identity, of their roots. It's a national tragedy.
But also one mother's tragedy. We have decided to show this little girl and tell her story in the hope that someone will recognize her and reunite her with her family. Njeri Mwangi, BBC News, Nairobi.
Now, in Brussels, talks about a future trade deal between the UK and the EU after Brexit are still going on, with the UK's chief negotiator saying there had been progress, but there was a lot to do. The main sticking points are these. There are fisheries, a small part of the UK's economic activity, but a symbolic one, with disagreement over the level of access that the EU will get to fish in UK waters. Fair competition is the second issue, also known as the level playing field. The EU says the UK must stick to agreed rules on government aid to British firms so that there's no unfair advantage. And third is what's known as the governance of the deal. That's to say, if an agreement is reached, who will police it and how will they police it? Just 6 weeks to go to the final deadline for a deal to be agreed and to be ratified by both sides, which is a tall order by any measure. Let's join our Europe editor, Katja Adler, in Brussels tonight. So with those factors still in play, Katja, how do you assess things?
Well, we have seen this timetable slipping and slipping, haven't we, Hugh? And I think I could forgive you an eye roll when I say that these weeks now are crucial. But they absolutely are, because you've done the math, 6 weeks until the end of the transition period. By that time, a deal has to have been reached and signed off by the Parliament in the UK and the European Parliament as well. So what is holding the two parties back? Well, basically, difficult political compromises. The EU needs to compromise big time on its fishing rights in UK waters. That's difficult for fishing countries like France and Spain. As for the UK, well, the government does not want to be tied to Brussels' apron strings after Brexit. But the EU says, look, you want access to our single market that we don't offer any other non-EU member state. So we have to agree fair competition rules, and we have to find a way to make sure both of us keep to those rules. To be clear, Hugh, the choice before the government isn't between a hard Brexit and a soft Brexit. The UK is leaving the EU's customs union and single market. So the choice here is between a hard Brexit with a deal or no deal at all. Both sides still say they want a deal, but what we're not sure of is whether they're both willing to move enough to clinch one.
Katja, many thanks again. Katja Adler with the latest on those talks there in Brussels. Now, the product manager for the supplier of most of the insulation for Grenfell Tower has told the inquiry into the fire that his company, Celotex, deliberately cheated to pass a fire safety test. John Roper told the hearing that Celotex was desperate to take business from a rival firm. He then helped to cover up the cheating, which he admitted amounted to fraud. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons has the details.
In 2014, Celotex was desperate for its insulation panels to be picked for the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. But 3 years later, the insulation installed behind cladding panels was blamed for helping the flames to spread. This is the standard lab test to prove how building systems handle fire. Here, they're testing cladding panels. Testing is crucial for manufacturers trying to break new products into markets. The inquiry heard that in 2014, Celotex effectively rigged the test carried out on its insulation.
Did that not strike you at the time as dishonest?
Yes, it did, yeah.
But you went along with it?
I went along with a lot of actions at Celotex that, looking back on reflection, were completely unethical.
After one failed test, Celotex commissioned this rig, which contains less insulation and extra magnesium oxide boards, which don't burn. Celotex used the test results to market its product as safe for tall buildings. But in information for clients, John Roper removed the reference to the extra magnesium boards.
I was 22, 23, first job. I thought this was standard practice, albeit it did sit very uncomfortably with me.
Celotex says following disciplinary processes, staff have left the company. But it's not just the public inquiry which is investigating. The police are too. Tom Simons, BBC News.
Before we go tonight, the story of a British diplomat who has become something of a local hero in one part of China after he saved the life of a student who was in danger of drowning in a river in the southwest of the country. Stephen Ellison, who took up his post as Consul General only a month ago, jumped in to save the young woman. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale takes up the story.
A sunny day by the river, but look closely on the left. Someone's fallen in. There's a moment of shock. No one moves. The woman's clearly struggling as she disappears under the bridge. She's beginning to lose consciousness. But step forward Stephen Ellison, Her Majesty's Consul General in Chongqing, with natty socks. The 61-year-old diplomat didn't hesitate.
There's no time to think, there's no time to consider. There's no rational decisions. There was a girl clearly in some great difficulties, and I think, if no one had taken action, she clearly would have lost her life.
As he pulls for the bank, he lifts her face clear. For a short time, he feared the worst. But suddenly, she's breathing again.
I'm sure someone would have jumped in. I was just sort of first to get my shoes off and jump in.
After a struggle, they eventually haul her up, and our sodden hero climbs out to the side.
I've had a few comments from my friends on the socks, yes. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to take my iPhone out of my pocket, so that's gone and seen better days, I think, now. So,
Mr. Ellison has been hailed a hero in China, where his courage has been shared with millions on social media and done much to improve Britain's reputation. The woman, a 24-year-old student from Wuhan, has recovered and invited her rescuer to dinner next weekend. James Landale, BBC News.
That's it from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.